What's going on, guys? It's your boy Triple S here, and today we're talking about Skullgirls. Now, for those of you who don't know, Skullgirls is an indie fighting game best known for its unique art style and crazy combos. It's been around for almost 9 years, but it's still getting new content to this day and is experiencing a resurgence in popularity due to the release of the newest DLC character, Annie of the Stars. Now, why is Annie such a big deal? Well, she's the first DLC character the game has received in over half a decade, and she was a heavily requested character. After Annie's full release this May, Skullgirls will also be receiving 3 more DLC characters, one coming later this year and 2 more in 2022. Now, many years ago, during a particularly rough time in the game's development, the devs turned to the fans for financial support through an Indiegogo campaign in which the fans got to decide a few of the upcoming characters through a poll. Of the 31 possible characters that were offered, the fans would ultimately choose Eliza and Beowulf to be the characters who would become playable, although Annie, another character who did very well in the fan polls, would later be added in the modern era of Skullgirls DLC we are in right now. So as a Skullgirls fan myself, I'm very excited at the prospect of more DLC, and I couldn't help but do a little speculation as to who the remaining 3 DLC characters might be. And as for the candidates, I turned to the remaining 28 characters of the Indiegogo poll. Now, there's a decent chance that some of the 3 remaining DLC characters might not even be from this list, since we have gotten out of left field characters before like Fukuwa, but I think it's pretty safe to assume that at least one of them will be from this old list. So I'd like to take a look at all 28 characters on this list and tell you what I think of them, as well as how good I think their chances are. Before we begin, I want to note that I will be factoring in the proposed movesets for these characters, even though they are not set in stone and the newer devs could easily end up taking any character in a completely different direction. Even then, I like to think that they'd at least look at the old ideas before implementing the character, so the way I see it, the proposed movesets do matter to a certain extent. Alright, so without further ado, let's begin. So first up we have Umbrella. Now, Umbrella is the younger sister of Parasol, and her weapon, the umbrella-looking thing she's holding, is known as Hunger. Basically, the way her proposed moveset works is that the longer she doesn't use Hunger, the hungrier it gets and the more powerful it becomes. So do I think Umbrella stands a good chance of getting in? Absolutely. I think her chances are a lot greater than most of the other contenders, simply because she was originally going to be in the base roster of Skullgirls, but got shafted in favor of Valentine. She's also one of the most important characters to the canon timeline, so from a lore perspective, she has even more reason to be added. Unfortunately for her, Umbrella only did okay in the fan polls, placing roughly in the middle. However, there are still a lot of longtime fans that want to see Umbrella finally get in after all these years. On a more personal note, I have to say that I am not among those fans who are rooting for Umbrella. Her design doesn't interest me all that much, and her proposed fighting style and gimmick only moderately interest me. The thing that really lowers my opinion of Umbrella is that we already have a character who uses a similar weapon in Parasol. I'm not saying the devs couldn't make her completely unique, but I just think there's overall just less unique concepts to be explored here, and the existing roster already kind of has range protection warfare covered. Next up is Marie, and she's definitely a top contender. For those of you who don't know who she is pretty much the namesake of the game, being the Skullgirl most relevant to every character's story. She is essentially the thread that ties everyone together because just about everyone wants to either stop her or claim her power for their own. Now, she may appear as a boss in every character's story mode, but currently she is only playable in challenge mode and she cannot be used in actual matches. It's safe to assume that if she did become a DLC character, she'd handle a lot differently than her boss iteration for balance purposes. Her proposed moveset instead focuses more on her being a maid and using her vacuum to attack opponents. She did alright in the fan polls and is more recognizable than some of the actual fully playable characters in Skullgirls, so I think she has a really good chance. On a personal note, I like Marie. If she gets in, I hope she has a blockbuster where she turns into one of her boss forms for a short period of time, similar to Double's Moai statue transformation. Next we have Black Dahlia, who is best known for being a ruthless hitwoman in the Medici Mafia. Her proposed moveset includes using grenade launchers, tear gas, and a lot of trickery. She did really well in the fan polls, and her popularity has stayed strong in the Skullgirls community since then. A lot of people seem to think she's a shoo-in, and I can't help but agree. In fact, she seems more likely to me than the other two characters I've mentioned thus far, and they were also top contenders. Now, what do I think of Black Dahlia? I think she's alright. I feel like they could take her moveset in many different directions, so if she does get in, then I'm excited to see which direction they end up taking her. Now on to Mrs. Victoria. She is a high school teacher who is probably best known for her prominent position in the background of the training mode stage, an honor that she now shares with the professional player Sonic Fox. Her proposed moveset revolves around utilizing various classroom supplies such as textbooks and chalk, and she can also use a wide variety of fighting game moves. Now, do I think she's likely? No, not really. She didn't shine particularly bright in the fan polls, and unfortunately there are only so many slots, as there's no way all 28 of these characters will make it in. Now, what do I think of her? I'll tell you a bit more about that with the next character. And here we have Deep Violet, the alter ego of Mrs. Victoria. By day she is an ordinary high school teacher, but by night she is a heroic crime fighter. Despite being the same person as Victoria, her proposed playstyle is completely different, as Deep Violet makes use of her whip weapon. She also did not do particularly well in the fan polls, and doesn't have a relatively large fan following in the present day either. Now, as for my thoughts, if either of them get in, I'm hoping they'd be a stance change character where once certain conditions are met, you switch from Victoria to Violet or vice versa. That way we get two characters for one, and fans of both are happy. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of either of them separately, but I think that if merged, they have a lot of interesting potential in areas that no other character really has. Now, I want you to take a good, long look at the screen. Tell me what you see. I'll tell you what I see. Absolute perfection. This is Stanley Whitefin. Once a scientist, he now uses his inventions to participate in the Skullgirls conflict directly. His proposed moveset revolves around various shark-related moves, such as swimming through the ground. He can also pull out some of his deadly inventions to assist him in battle, such as lasers, proton cannons, and a jetpack. Not only that, but he's also a proficient boxer as well. So there's a lot going on with Stanley, and if it isn't already obvious, Stanley is in fact the potential DLC character that I want to see the most out of everyone. Not only that, but Stanley is actually my second most wanted playable character in any fighting game. If you're interested in who the first is, I'll leave a card for that video here. Anyways, I just love Stanley's design. His proposed moveset just screams potential to me. He can pull from just about any science fiction weapon you can think of, not to mention his shark and boxing abilities. Now, does our beloved Finn friend actually stand a decent chance of making it into the game as fully playable? Yeah, I'd say he's on the better end of the spectrum. He actually did incredibly well in the fan polls, more so than most of the other characters I've mentioned so far. Unfortunately, many people just kind of view him as a meme character, and his overall popularity has seemingly waned a bit since the fan polls of long ago. But that doesn't mean he won't still get added. I'd say the existence of a second Skullgirls season pass would help his chances tremendously. Anyways, even though I could talk about Stanley the Manly all day, it's time to move on to the next character, although we will revisit Stanley briefly in a few minutes. Let's talk about Hive. She's an ASG soldier whose proposed moveset revolves around various bee-related attacks. She can also take to the skies with various unconventional mobility options and manipulate her synthetic parasite to turn into spears and other various weapons. She moves like a bee, stings like a bee, and even talks like a bee, randomly buzzing during conversations. However, she did incredibly poorly in the fan polls, so I really don't see her getting in over other characters, but anything can happen. Personally, I think Hive's just okay. There's not really anything I love about her or anything I hate about her either. But I do think there are a lot of other characters in this list with more potential than her, so let's move on. Next up is Leduc. He's a younger ASG soldier, and electricity is the name of his game. In his proposed moveset, he can use electricity to stun opponents, use magnetism to attract and repel them, and use static electricity to hang onto walls. He can also charge his attacks to create stronger variants of them. Leduc performed better in the fan polls than Hive, but not by much. He still did pretty poorly overall, but despite this, he has maintained a devout following in the Skullgirls community over the years. However, I think that similarly to Hive, he's likely to not be chosen in favor of more popular characters. On a personal note, I like him only slightly better than Hive. I think there are a lot of other, cooler, more unique gimmicks to be explored than just electricity. Granted, Leduc does do a lot with his electricity in his proposed moveset, but it's not quite enough to hold my interest over other characters. Here we have Ileum. She acts as a mother figure to some of the younger members of Lab 8, and she is absolutely terrifying. Basically, she can contort her body any which way she wants and uses digestive enzymes secreted from her skin to dissolve her opponents. She can also spit acid and hit opponents with drill bits embedded deeper inside of her. So, how do you think Ileum did in the fan polls? She actually didn't do too hot. In fact, she placed really low overall. And so, similar to other low placing characters, I really don't think the devs have much of an incentive to choose her when there are other characters they know are more popular. Personally, I have to go against the vote on this one. I love Ileum. I think that body horror is a style that works very well in Skullgirls because I really like the way it was implemented on Double. Having an entire character with that as a design theme really appeals to me. Another one of my favorites. In fact, my second most wanted Skullgirls potential DLC character overall, it's Brain Drain. Now, what makes Brain Drain so cool? Well, I like his design and his backstory is cool too. Basically, after Lab 7 was destroyed, he lost most of his body and the majority of his ability to sympathize with humans. He's also one of the most feared members of the deadly Lab 0. Also, his proposed moveset includes two gimmicks that are some of my absolute favorites of the bunch. Let's call these two abilities Possession and Customization. Possession allows Brain Drain to temporarily take direct control of the opponent if he successfully lands a snapback attack, pretty much forcing the opponent to fight their own team members. Customization involves Brain Drain analyzing one of the opponent's moves and recreating it as a part of his own moveset through a hologram. I think these two gimmicks have the potential to really make Brain Drain stand out from the rest of the cast. Plus, he'd be our first male villain. Now, from a slightly more objective standpoint, does Brain Drain actually have a good shot? I'd say he has a modest chance. He did fair in the fan polls, but fair isn't that great when there's only 3 confirmed open slots left. However, he could still get in. He's definitely in a better spot than characters like Hive, in my opinion. Next up is Andy the Anvil. He is a member of Peacock's gang and is actually a figment of her imagination brought to life. Although, in actuality, Andy is what Peacock perceives Stanley to be. And since Stanley is such a boxing nerd, Andy cranks that aspect of him up to 11. Aside from boxing, Andy also makes use of his friend Tommy 10 Tons to best the competition. Now, how did Andy do in the polls of long ago? Not too good, honestly. I think that everyone's favorite Anvil here has a chance, but a very, very small one. And what do I think of him? I like him just fine, but I don't like him as much as the original Stanley, since Andy seems to be a lot more unidimensional to me. Moving on, we have Feng, a migrant from the Dragon Empire and an acrobat in the Cirque du Cart. She's also friends with Cerebella. You see those two things on her head? Yeah, those are actually birds that can grant her various boons in combat, like acting as a focal point for aerial attacks or powering up special moves. She did well in the polls, but not quite as well as characters like Annie and Stanley. However, Feng has remained a strong fan favorite in the community, at least from what I've seen. She has a decent chance of making it in. On a more personal note, I'm really not a huge fan of Feng. Nothing in her proposed moveset really wows me. but once again, that is just my opinion. Now on to Taliesin, and he's a bit of a weird one. Taliesin is another Cirque de Carte character who's responsible for punishing members who violate their contract with the Cirque. His remote parasite Muse allows him to transform anything into a musical instrument, and he even collects the instruments of his unfortunate victims. His proposed moveset revolves around Taliesin performing the punch moves while Muse handles the kicks, and they also have a stance where the two are physically attached to each other. Now Taliesin didn't do too well in the polls, but I wouldn't really call his placement terrible either. If there's one thing that Taliesin doesn't have to worry about when it comes to being playable, it's being mistaken for a different fighter. However, I believe he lacks the raw fan demand needed to convince the devs that he's a worthwhile inclusion. But then again, anyone can get in, I just don't find the masked bard all that likely. Getting even more subjective, I really like Taliesin's design, but his proposed moveset is just okay to me. If he does somehow manage to make it in, I'd be very interested to see him interact with Big Band, since the two share a love of musical instruments, but are on opposite ends of the morality spectrum. Next up is Hubrecht, another character from the Cirque faction, and he's a bit of a sad case. You see, Hubrecht is a friendly circus strongman who doesn't realize the troupe he works for is actually a talent pool for the mob. But that isn't even the sad part. The real tragedy is Hubrecht's chance of making it in. You see, not only did Hubrecht do pretty bad in the polls, but he's also similar in several ways to a character already in the game, namely Beowulf. The two might look quite different and have vastly different stories, but Hubrecht's proposed moveset revolves around grabs, something Beowulf in particular is known for. Now obviously it's just a proposed moveset and they could just end up going a completely different direction with Hubrecht, but why would they bother when there are so many other characters with more original ideas that already exist and are also far more popular with the fans? And that's not even getting into the whole debate of whether Beowulf's victory in the polls was earned in the first place, as many members of the community would contest that point as well. I see Hubrecht as one of, if not the most unlikely inclusions of the list. And personally, I'm indifferent. I think there's far better characters in this list than Hubrecht, and in fact, one of them is the very next character on this list. This is Regina, and in some ways she's in an even more sad situation than Hubrecht. She's the beast tamer of the Cirque de Carte and commands a wide array of bizarre animal specimens. Her proposed moveset takes full advantage of this by having her beasts and minions jump in and attack. Now on to the sad part. Regina is actually the character who has the distinction of coming in last place out of everyone in the fan polls. This wouldn't really bother me so much if it were a character I didn't like, but Regina has to be in my top 5 overall most wanted from this list. I think that a moveset revolving around animal attacks has the potential to be one of the most creative and unique movesets in the game. Some of my favorite Skullgirls characters have one thing in common, a consistent theme throughout their moveset. For Big Band, it's jazz. For Peacock, it's early cartoons. For Valentine, it's medical equipment. You get the idea. When I look at Regina, I see a character who has the potential to be one of them, so I find it unfortunate that she bombed in the polls. But yes, I think she's very unlikely considering she did get last place. Now on to Beatrix, who is Cerebel's rival at the Cirque de Carte. She can use her Cloak of Damocles to store a wide array of weapons, and her proposed moveset has her use the cloak to counter enemies' attacks and make enemy projectiles vanish with a well-placed swipe of her cape. Now personally, I like Beatrix and would be glad to see her get in. She seems like she has the potential to be a cool rival character, but unfortunately, the vote says otherwise. While Beatrix didn't do too hot in the polls, I'd say she certainly stands a better chance than those last two characters I mentioned. Let's talk about Ottomo. He's a robot henchman of the Medicis who is piloted by Stanley's rival, Tom. He might appear refined, but his pilot likes to make things interesting, as Ottomo's proposed moveset has him use a variety of dance moves to destroy anyone in his way. This might sound like a joke, but it's surprisingly effective, and, spoiler alert for the mobile game, he's also responsible for the death of Philia's parents. Now, Ottomo did very poorly in the polls, so I don't really see him getting in, but of course it's not impossible. Personally, I like Ottomo, and I think a dance-based moveset has a lot of cool potential. It's Yu-Wan time. Yu-Wan is an expert chef and a good friend of Ms. Fortune. He's short and manic, and his proposed moveset has him slice and dice opponents while depictions of intricate food dishes appear behind them. Yu-Wan is another one I like a lot, but he's also unfortunately another low placer in the polls. A character with a food-based moveset has been something I've wanted in Skullgirls since before I even knew of the existence of this list, so I was pretty happy to learn about Yu-Wan. Now, let's talk about Minette, and there's a lot to unpack here. First, let's talk about who she is. Minette is one of the River King's daughters who works as a waitress at Yu-Wan's restaurant. Later on in the story, she's kidnapped under orders from Lorenzo Medici. Now, how did Minette do in the polls? Absurdly well. She frequently challenged Annie for the number 2 spot overall and sometimes even surpassed her. She is, without a doubt, the highest ranked character to not yet be playable in Skullgirls. From what I've heard, back in the day there used to be a huge rivalry between Annie and Minette supporters. Not only that, but Minette has remained popular in the Skullgirls community after all these years, getting a ridiculous amount of fan art. The girl has a cult, and it is for that reason that I believe she will without a doubt be one of the 3 next DLC characters. In fact, it's not much of a stretch to call her the most likely out of everyone. Now as for what I think of her, well, I do have an issue with her, and it's a pretty big one. I am not a fan of her proposed moveset, which has her deliver food to various bystanders during the match, and these bystanders kind of do her fighting for her. Minette herself will collect tips from the customers with a super, which will increase her confidence enough for her to overcome her normal clumsiness. This just sounds very unappealing to me. My main gripe is that Minette is more concerned about her customers than the fight itself. And this kind of gives me the impression that she's not really interested in winning the match. In other fighting games, these kinds of characters can be really irritating to fight against because the entire time they just don't even care about combat and are winning seemingly on accident. I'm fine with gag characters, but this specific variety of them has always gotten under my skin. I hope that if Minette gets in, they just take her in a completely different direction where she actually cares about the fight while still being true to her character. But all that said, I do like Minette herself. I like her design, and I'll be happy for her fans if she gets in, which as I mentioned earlier, is pretty much a guarantee. Let's discuss Scythana. She's a half-Geigen, half-human prisoner of the Canopy Kingdom, or at least she was until she decided to take her freedom back by force. Her proposed moveset has her pick up fallen teammates and use them as weapons. She can also become more beastly during certain vicious attacks, and use the chains on her arms to defend from blows. Also, she's around 12 feet tall, so she'd likely be scaled down or have very poor posture so that all of her fits on the screen at one time. Reminds me of a certain someone. Anyways, Scythana placed close to the middle in the fan polls, so I'd say her chances of getting in are modest, but she's definitely in a better spot than most of the other ones. Personally, I kind of agree with the crowd on this one in that I'm pretty neutral on Scythana, but I think she might be cool. I must say though, if they do go for the whole using fallen teammates as weapons thing, how would that work in 1v1s? But then again, you could say the same thing about Valentine's Rebirth Ex Machina, so I'm sure they'd think of something. Next up is Roxie, and she's the chief engineer of the Black Egrets and is known for always having the right set of tools for the job. She loves to take machines apart, only to reassemble them with some of her own added flair. For her proposed moveset, she specializes in rushdown with an emphasis on priority rather than agility. She can wield hammers, rivet guns, and various machine parts. Additionally, she can ask her crew to fly in particularly large pieces of equipment to be used as wrecking balls to knock over the competition, and use cans of spray paint on the enemy for status effects. Roxie placed near the middle of the polls, so I'd say she's very much in a similar situation to Scythana. And as for my take on Roxie, I like her just fine. Perhaps the thing I like the most about this character is that there seems to be a lot of different ideas going around here, which could make for a really interesting moveset. Granted, some of the people who originally had these ideas have been asked to leave the Skullgirls project for good reason, but fortunately, a lot of the character ideas they had are spelled out here in a simple language that anyone can understand. If you're interested on reading up on Roxie or any of the characters I'm talking about in this video, I'll leave a link to the original concepts in the description. But now it's time to talk about Panzerfaust. He's a super soldier created by Lab 3 who now serves under Parasol and the Black Egrets. He's extremely powerful but also very reckless. His proposed moveset includes a gimmick where he will fire a blast from his tank arm after every punch attack if you press the button a second time. He'd also have super armor on many of his moves. Panzerfaust did very well in the polls, often placing right up there with Black Dahlia and Stanley. He's also maintained a fan base in the Skullgirls community even after so many years. So I think Panzerfaust has a good shot of making it in, but I wouldn't call him a shoo-in like some higher placed characters are. Now as for my opinion of Panzerfaust, well, I'm not exactly a huge fan, and it has nothing to do with his proposed moveset. I think that actually sounds really cool. No, my problem with Panzerfaust is actually the exact opposite of my Minette problem. I just think that he looks a bit too similar to Big Band. They're both kind of giant blobs with monochromatic eyes and breathing masks. I love Big Band, and I love Beowulf, and if this game ever gets a third male character, I want it to be someone who will stand out from the others in both design and playstyle, and unfortunately Panzerfaust only covers one of those bases for me. Now on to Adam, who is a jack-of-all-trades soldier in the Black Egrets. He's very skilled at his job, but because he's skilled at everything rather than just one thing in particular, he has a bit of trouble standing out from his fellow soldiers. He also gets tasked with babysitting Umbrella rather frequently. Adam's proposed playstyle is unique in that he actually brings in two faceless egrets to fight with him, both of whom act as a third of his life bar. Once an egret's health is gone, they're out for the rest of the fight, and the next one hops in. Adam himself joins the fight once the other two are gone, and he has access to moves that the other two cannot perform. So Adam didn't do too hot in the polls, which I find funny since not standing out from the others is his problem in-universe as well, so it's oddly fitting. And personally, I'm not a huge fan of Adam. I think we see enough of faceless egrets in Parasol's moveset, so I'm not all that interested in controlling one directly, but that's just me. Next up on the list we have Molly, and she's kind of unique in that we got multiple different images for her, something no one else on the list has. But before we get to that, let me explain who Molly is. She is the communications officer of the Black Egrets, so basically it's her job to make sure the team stays connected. Her network of communications devices has become so intricate and versatile that by this point it's basically a weapon system. Her proposed moveset is basically anything and everything phone related, so telephones, payphones, cans on strings, etc. This machine she has on the right is called the Grammotron, and it's pretty much a giant phone robot suit. Molly placed well in the polls, but she's closer to the middle than the top. I'd say she's one of those characters who stands a small chance of making it in, but would stand a much better chance if there ended up being a second season pass after the first one. Now initially with Molly I actually had two different gripes, but after looking into it further I did a 180 on one of those gripes. So my first major problem with Molly is actually her voice. Yeah, Molly has speaking parts in several characters' story modes, and in those she has a really nasal tone of voice that just really irritates me, and when I think about having to listen to a whole match full of that, I shudder internally. Now I'm not really faulting Molly's voice actress for this because she voices other characters in the game like Umbrella and Minette, and she does a great job with them. I just think that the character's voice was probably supposed to sound that way on purpose, but that doesn't change the fact that it bothers me. Now for the complaint I changed my mind on, which was her proposed moveset. I initially thought that phones wasn't a broad enough concept to make for an interesting full moveset, but the more I thought about the different kinds of phones there are, the more I realized that there's actually an absurd amount of stuff she can pull from. So overall, I do like Molly, but if she gets in, you'll probably find me playing with the volume down more often than not. And now, on to Isaac. He's an archaeologist hailing from the Canopy Kingdom who is hunted for his life after making a particularly shocking discovery. Fortunately, he's very adept at eluding his pursuers thanks to his ability to travel through time. His proposed moveset focuses heavily on this time travel gimmick, allowing him to do things such as attack from the future and accelerate the in-game timer. He placed extraordinarily well in the polls, often giving Minette and Annie a run for their money. He stands a very good shot of making it in, especially if there end up being multiple season passes. Personally, I love Isaac. He's my third most wanted because I think a time-based character is just about one of the coolest out of all of these proposed movesets. There is one other time-based character on this list, but don't worry, we'll get to her very soon. We are in the home stretch now, and it's time to talk about Venus. She is the goddess of space and is without a doubt one of the most powerful characters in the Skullgirls universe. However, the character you are seeing on screen right now is not actually the entirety of Venus, because if all of her were made visible, she would basically consume the entire screen. Her proposed moveset revolves around her manipulating space to attack with random body parts from any distance. She can also conjure locusts from seemingly out of nowhere, and also open up holes in space and use them to teleport or even distort the stage itself. Venus did well in the polls, so I think we stand a good chance of getting her eventually. However, since she is a literal goddess of space and is one of the overarching antagonists, I think it's much more likely that she'll get in later rather than sooner. Maybe if there's a second season pass and the devs realize that the second one will be the final one, then they'd go for Venus to end with a bang. That's my prediction at least. However, Venus definitely has some rather stiff competition when it comes to being the end with a bang character, as we will soon see. But staying on Venus for just a bit longer, I think she has the potential to be a really cool character. Like I mentioned before with Ileum, body horror is a style that works really well in Skullgirls, and here with Venus we have a character with that as their entire gimmick, and that gets 2 thumbs up from me. Now on to her sister, Aeon. Whereas space is Venus's playground, time is Aeon's domain. However, her time manipulating abilities are far more fantastical than those of Isaac. She can attack using versions of characters from alternate timelines, and even capture scenes of the current fight to unleash them later as attacks. Aeon did very well in the polls, even better than her sister Venus. Later on, she even managed to surpass her fellow timebender Isaac a few times. Similarly to Venus, I think that Aeon has a really good shot, but we'll probably see her closer to the end of Skullgirls DLC because of how important to the story she is. I like Aeon just fine, although honestly I prefer her 2 direct competitors over her for different reasons. I prefer Venus for the aforementioned proposed moveset revolving around body horror, and I prefer Isaac because his time-related gimmicks sound just a bit more fun to me. But honestly, I'll be really happy if we get either of the time-related characters. Last and probably least, we have Samson. Now this is not the same Samson that resides on the back of our Philia's head, as this is actually a version of Samson who is much more selfish than the parasite we all know and love. This alternate version of him has actually forcefully subdued his host and has taken complete control. Now, instead of helping protect Philia, Samson uses his full power to take care of himself. His proposed moveset revolves around using stronger variants of Philia's moves and transforming into the strongest animals in all of nature to overwhelm the enemy through sheer brute force. Now, Samson didn't do very well in the polls, and so I think his chances of getting in are pretty low. I have to say that I'm really not a huge fan of this Samson for a few reasons. Firstly, I think it's kind of sad seeing Samson like this, even if this isn't the real him. The real Samson actually cares about Philia a lot, as seen in her story mode and her backstory in the mobile game, so seeing him behave like this is kind of painful in a way. The other reason I'm not a huge fan is that we already have a Philia derivative character in Fuqua, so I don't think we really need another one. I do like the part of Samson's proposed moveset where he turns into powerful animals, but honestly the negatives just outweigh the positives for me on this one. So there you have it. Every character from the Skullgirls Indiegogo polls of long ago explained, as well as my thoughts on them. If I had to pick who I think the final 3 characters of the season pass would be, I'd guess Black Dahlia, Minette, and Umbrella. And if we get a bonus character, then Marie. But that's just scratching the surface of speculation. There are also characters who are not in the Indiegogo polls like Irvin, who could also end up getting in. And then there's an ice cream truck? Wait, what? What does an ice cream truck have to do with Skullgirls character speculation? Well, I'll tell you about all that and much more in a future video if this one does well enough. So if you want to see that video, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. I promise you that hitting that bell does not mean you're getting comboed by Big Band, but it will notify you whenever I upload. So thank you guys for watching, and I will see you later.